Welcome back to episode 19 of the Rugby History Project. I'm your host Hattie, and today we're looking at, in his own little spiritual world, the lives of Carwyn James. Remember to like, rate and subscribe wherever you're listening or watching today's episode, as it does really help grow the project. Carwyn James's life was one of many segments, remembered primarily for his achievements with the British and Irish Lions. His personal life and Navy career are discussed at length as well. A life cut short at just 53, today we look back at his complex and often secretive life. It is perhaps not unusual to refer to a deceased public figure as tragic, but it is perhaps unusual to refer to a deceased public figure as lonely. Yet those are the two descriptors often tagged alongside genius and enigma when referring to Carwyn James. He remains the only coach to lead the British and Irish Lions to a series victory over the All Blacks, yet he never coached the Welsh national team. Described as the man that everybody knew about but nobody knew, his personal life was subject to both rumour and speculation, both during and after his life. Carwyn was born on the 2nd of November 1929 in Cefn, a small village in Carmarthenshire that had been home to the James family for just a few years, as his parents and three older siblings had moved there from Rhydlewis in Ceredigion when his older brother was still very, very young. Whilst he visited his extended family often throughout his childhood, he was the only member of his family not born in Ceredigion. Reportedly, this gave him a sense of otherness from the rest of his family, something which he'd feel throughout his life. In Cefn, he was known to be a conscientious child who attended chapel and helped out with the local post office, as well as playing soccer in the local fields with other children. Growing up in wartime West Wales, James's early life would have been shaped by economic hardship, despite his family moving to seek work. Education was extremely important to the Welsh-speaking James family, with Carwyn's mother insisting that her sons did not turn to the local mines for work, as her husband had been forced to do. Whilst his elder brother had attended the more rural Llandilo Secondary before moving on to work in local banks, Carwyn passed the entrance exams to the Gwendraeth Grammar School. At the Gwendraeth, he became incredibly close with his Welsh teacher, abandoning his plans to study STEM subjects in sixth form in order to continue his studies under her. It was also at the Gwendraeth that he was first recognised for his rugby prowess. Whilst he was unsuccessful in his first attempt, James would go on to represent the Wales school side for 2 years. Gaining 6 caps, 3 of which were as captain, it allowed James to travel for the first time as well. It also put him on the radar for local giants Llanelli RFC, who brought him in to start a game before he'd even left school. Unfortunately for James, the Scarlets were thrashed by the opposition, and it significantly set back his confidence. James's ability as an athlete expanded far beyond rugby, as he was a keen cricketer and even snooker player before leaving for university. He also reportedly once turned down a trial at Cardiff City Football Club at the age of 16. James was the first in his family to attend university, studying Welsh at the University of Aberystwyth. Interestingly, the Welsh schoolboys captain was not immune to university rugby politics, as he was blocked from playing first-team rugby during his first year of university. John Alfie Brace was the captain for the 1948-49 season, which meant he was also head of the selection committee. As Brace fancied himself a fly half, James was relegated to playing for the second 15. In his first year of university, he also played for Aberystwyth Town along with other local clubs, while still staying on the radar of Llanelli RFC. He became captain of the university's first 15 in his second and third years after Brace's graduation. Carwyn's time at university is often remembered for his various rugby escapades, as well as his nationalist political values. However, it should be noted that this is the period in which he may have begun to explore his sexuality for the first time. James's biographer, Alan Gibbard, discloses that 2 anonymous academics confirm that James was in a relationship with a fellow male student during this time. It was also during this period that he began his close friendship with fellow student David Bowen. Gibbard does not explicitly state that Bowen and James were in a relationship. However, it is somewhat implied. The pair travelled together to Ireland, and whilst Bowen also visited the James family home often during their university days. Later, in 1958 and 1959, when James was in his late 20s, he spent his summer holidays with Bowen. Bowen noted that the two enjoyed 2 serene summers together as adults. The pair were extremely close, and whilst modern eyes may read further into their relationship, there is simply no concrete evidence that they were in a romantic relationship in any way. As Bowen wrote following James's death, many things remain that no one else will know. Following university, James spent time in the Navy. Despite his nationalist ideology, later pacifism, and his inability to swim. Whilst most men at his age began their national service at 17 or 18, James had been given a deferment in order to attend university. With a language degree, James was selected to be a member of the Joint Services School for Linguistics, or the JSSL. Here, James learnt Russian and frequently travelled with the armed forces as a translator. Very little is known in this period of his life, which has led to rumours that he was actually a spy rather than working as a translator. The scant information that we do have comes from interviews with fellow service members who have stated that James travelled to Scotland and Berlin during this era. These same men, who knew James very well, did not know anything of his sexuality, reportedly. Instead, they spoke of his rugby and singing abilities. During his national service period, he played in many armed forces rugby union matches. Like many Welsh players before him, he was spotted by rugby league scouts. However, unlike players such as Clive Sullivan, James chose to turn down his particular offer, which was to play professional rugby for Oldham. Whilst he'd be required to return to the JSSL throughout his early adult life for certain periods, he returned to Wales pretty much full-time in 1954. It was at this point that he began his dual career as a rugby player and teacher, teaching Welsh at Queen Elizabeth Grammar School for a very brief period before moving to Llandovery College to become the illustrious private school's first ever head of Welsh. Continuing his playing career at Llanelli, he also achieved 2 full Wales caps, one at fly half and one at inside centre. His international career was hampered by the dominance of Cliff Morgan. Morgan was roughly the same size as James, but he was significantly stronger, and he was also the incumbent 10 when James rose through the ranks. While some have argued that Morgan's selection was a reflection of an East Wales or Cardiff bias in the selection criteria, it does make sense that the more senior of the two was the first choice. There were no hard feelings between the pair though, and James actually stayed with Morgan and his wife just before his ill-fated trip to Amsterdam in 1983. James began developing his coaching philosophy after becoming the head of rugby at Llandovery in 1964. By this stage, the then 34-year-old James's hope of more Wales caps were more than over. Whilst coaching schoolboy rugby was seen as necessary as the players needed to learn to actually play the game, coaches in senior rugby were often seen as unnecessary. In 1964, James took part in a week-long coaching course in Dublin. It was an incredibly novel idea, and 3 of the men who attended the course would go on to coach the British and Irish Lions. Ronnie Dawson became the first Lions coach in 1968, while Sid Miller would coach the Lions in 1974. Both men coached their nation as well. Carwyn was appointed the head coach of Llanelli RFC in 1969, having left his post at Llandovery and taking up a role at Trinity College. Whilst James's life at Llandovery was both peaceful and fulfilling, he left specifically to coach a senior team in order to be in with a chance of coaching the Lions. This period of change in James's life proved to be incredibly chaotic. He left secondary education, leaving a cosy world with live-in accommodation for a higher institution without that. It was a huge change for him. He ended up moving back into the house he'd grown up in, and his ageing parents moved out to be in a nearby bungalow. The changes paid off, however, as just 6 months after taking the helm at Llanelli, he was given the Lions job. Whilst many of the non-Welsh players had not interacted with James before, he came highly recommended by the Welsh players. His short record at Llanelli was notable. However, his refusal to be at Stradey Park during Llanelli's game against the Springboks is perhaps his most notable moment to date. It was a good idea though. Well done. James's coaching achievements are some of the best in history. Of course, of particular note is his record against the All Blacks, famously being the only coach to lead the Lions to a series win against the All Blacks, but also beating them as the coach of Llanelli and again as the coach of the Barbarians. However, his newly increased fame across Britain impacted James's love of the game. Press interviews and speaking engagements were demanded of him, resulting in frequent travel across the UK. However, James himself often spoke of a need to speak of anything but rugby. The stress of the public pressure had an effect on James's health. It had been well known that Carwyn James was fond of a drink, but the Lions tour of New Zealand was the first documented incident of regular, incredibly heavy drinking, with reports of him drinking at least a bottle of wine per night. Another stressor on James were the swirling rumours regarding his sexuality. Whilst former players have mentioned not recognising or knowing of James's potential queerness in recent interviews, the rumours about his sexuality swirled at the Welsh Rugby Union. James attempted several times to join the board in the early 1970s, but he was denied each time. During this era, the WRU was dominated by Labour voting, English-speaking East Walians. Carwyn was the direct opposite, a staunch Welsh-speaking nationalist who had previously run as a parliamentary candidate for Plaid Cymru. This on its own may have been enough to stop his acceptance to the board for some. However, in the hyper-masculine world of sport, being gay was the ultimate sin. 1974 was perhaps the year which changed the trajectory of James's life forever. Whilst it's been deemed that that was the year that James was rejected by the WRU for the head coach role, it isn't quite true. James has applied in early 1974 and he was an obvious choice for the role. However, during the selection process, James's mother had actually passed away. James had always been sensitive to rejection, and it's likely that during that period of loss, he protected his own ego by withdrawing. In his letter of withdrawal, James explains that he would expect a certain level of control over the team, which he believed the union would be unwilling to give. One quote from the letter stands out: "I know that I am asking too much of the union, that change takes time." Whilst this was a reference to the control issue, it could also be a reflection of the optics of having a head coach who was heavily rumoured to be gay. Throughout his rugby playing and coaching career, James had been involved in Welsh language sports broadcasting and publication. His unique knowledge of both language and sport had been fundamental in the development of official Welsh language sporting terminology during these early days of Welsh language sports broadcasting. James moved to Cardiff after the death of his mother, strangely actually moving into a house share with John Dawes, who was the new Welsh head coach, and he began focusing almost entirely on broadcasting and speaking. Whilst he'd been previously working across the BBC and HTV, he heavily focused on his career at the BBC. James spent a significant period of time on the road during this period, travelling across the UK for speaking engagements. James had always been known to be a messy person, and his car specifically was known to be full of changes of clothes and gifts from various rugby clubs. His messy car was noted specifically by various anonymous BBC sources, some of whom claimed to Alan Gibbard that they had seen gay pornography in the boot of James's car. In 1977, James was approached by Rugby Rovigo to take on the role of head coach. Rovigo is a small city roughly 50 miles from Venice, and in the 1970s they had a desire to top the domestic table. In James's 2 seasons with Rovigo, he led them first to a second and then a first place finish. To celebrate their 1978-79 season win, the Rovigo team travelled to the Vatican to meet Pope John Paul II, leading to a slightly bizarre photo of James and the Pope. James's time in Italy seemed extremely peaceful. He taught English at a local private school and coached a laid-back yet competitive side. He was also able to continue his broadcasting work, as the BBC sent out a crew to document his experience in a programme titled Canaletti Bolognese. During his 2 years in Italy, there is evidence that James underwent a period of self-discovery, as seen in the books he left behind in his Italian flat. While sporting and Welsh language books were obviously found, so were a collection of romantic and erotic literature, including Delta of Venus by Anai Nin, a groundbreaking piece of erotic literature. It's certainly a surprising book for a middle-aged man to have on their bookshelf. After 2 seasons in Italy, James returned to Wales in 1979. Purchasing a house in Cardiff, James lived with his older sister Gwen. Gwen was also unmarried and had worked as a psychiatric nurse in England at a facility which did offer sexuality conversion therapy. Gwen provided a level of domestic stability which James required, as his previous day in Cardiff and in Italy had been marked by loneliness. Returning to work at the BBC, James began drinking even more heavily than he'd done previously, leading to a particularly notable incident in 1981 which resulted in his suspension. Having been drinking heavily, James went on to commentate on a Bridgend vs Swansea game for the radio. Unfortunately, he fell asleep mid-game, leading to him being sent to the Priory to dry out. It was also around the time that he had a minor heart attack, which he kept secret from those around him. Whilst James's family placed blame on the BBC for his welfare, it is safe to say that he'd been spiralling for a really long period of time. Alongside his heavy drinking, he was also a chain smoker who ate poorly. All of these things exacerbated a long-standing struggle with psoriasis. Returning to broadcasting in the autumn of 1982, Carwyn spent the last few months of his life juggling his poor health and his work at the BBC. Friends and family knew that Carwyn was struggling, and they were really pleased when he announced he was going away for some sun during the festive period. Unfortunately, those plans fell through, and James ended up in Amsterdam in early January 1983. The night before his departure, his sister and his brother tried to convince him not to go, as they believed him to be really ill. However, his BBC co-worker Graham Price visited that evening, and he reports that James was simply drunk. It is unknown what James got up to in his final week. However, based on the way he was found on the morning of the 11th of January 1983, he had planned to spend his final night in Amsterdam out and about on the town. Whilst his family did not pursue a full autopsy, it is believed that he suffered a heart attack while shaving. The sudden passing of Carwyn James caused shockwaves throughout Wales. Whilst his family held a private funeral at the family home, his memorial service the following week was heavily attended, and was even more widely reported. His memory has remained at the forefront of many Welsh rugby fans, especially Llanelli fans, with many memorial projects in his honour. However, whilst his sporting achievements are widely praised and remembered, most of the articles and posts about James have a slightly salacious element. While same-sex relations between women have actually always been legal in the United Kingdom, same-sex relationships between men have been illegal or were illegal between the Middle Ages and 1967. The campaign for decriminalisation began in the 1950s after an increase in police stings and arrests. Whilst the Wolfenden Report recommended the decriminalisation of homosexual acts for consenting men over the age of 21 in 1957, it took almost a decade for the legislation to pass due to extreme political pressure. When the Sexual Offences Act of 1967 was written into law in July 1967, Carwyn James was 37 years old. Despite homosexuality being legal, queer people had very free rights and, for example, were not protected in the workplace. For those working with children, such as teachers, coaches, nurses, etc., being queer was an accepted sackable offence. It was incredibly common for queer people to protect themselves by keeping their sexuality a secret, even if they were sexually active or in a relationship. When Wales's first Pride March was held in the summer of 1985, Carwyn James had been dead for 2.5 years. Following James's death, people from the various segments of his life have spoken out about his sexuality, either in coded or open language. His sister Gwen spoke of how Welsh people tended to keep secrets bottled up to their own detriment. As Gwen lived with her brother, this is particularly interesting and suggests that there was an element of don't ask, don't tell in their relationship. It's reported that James frequently came home late during his last years in Cardiff, and he didn't discuss where he'd been with his sister. He also kept gay literature in their shared home, which was found after his death. His niece Bethan has openly discussed how she overheard those in Cardiff rugby circles derogatory talking about her uncle having sex with men. Bethan has stated that she attempted to discuss this incident with her family, but she was simply brushed off. Many rugby-related figures have remained publicly neutral about his sexuality, often stating that they were unaware or naive. Navy friends have said the same. Welsh language and nationalist friends and colleagues have remained completely silent. BBC colleagues have spoken at length, however, about the rumours, off the record. Gibbard's biography speaks at length about the reported same-sex relationships with colleagues, pornography in the boot of his car, and even an incident when he was reportedly punched for propositioning an uninterested man on a night out in Cardiff in 1982. Whilst the BBC was probably the most socially liberal circle in which James publicly frequented, the off-the-record gossip from anonymous sources shows that there was an element of salaciousness and trivialisation about queerness generally, rather than true acceptance. An underreported aspect of James's life is his mental health struggles. His alcohol dependency, along with his depressive episodes, often attributed to his personal struggles of his sexuality. However, whilst his potential sexuality may have been a factor in his mental health struggles, depression, anxiety, stress, etc. can affect anyone regardless of their background or perceived struggles from other people. Interestingly, considering the time period in which James lived, he actually saw a psychiatrist. David Hughes was involved in nationalist circles, but he also saw James professionally as a patient. The James family have criticised Hughes for his lax approach to patient confidentiality after James's death, but his lengthy quote about his patient perhaps provides the clearest view of Carwyn James at the time of his death. Carwyn was a man who carried many burdens, which were more than most of us can comprehend, let alone endure. They were psychological and physical burdens, and I don't know how he managed to cope so well and be such a productive man. David Hughes, shortly after the death of Carwyn James. Carwyn James's legacy burns bright, whilst one particular news outlet enjoys a yearly article about his spy past, and the day the pubs ran dry is celebrated just as frequently. Talk of James's sexuality is brought up as a footnote pretty often. This article has spoken at length about the evidence which could suggest that James was attracted to men. It has done so with the context of queerness in Britain at which the time James lived. This context is often missing from discussions about James's sexuality, but it's perhaps, however, the most important aspect of the discussion. Whether Carwyn James was simply an introvert, a man racked with anxiety, a gay man during an intolerant era, or a combination thereof, he was certainly someone who struggled and used a combination of alcohol and food as a coping mechanism. Whilst it's unlikely that we will ever have concrete evidence of his sexuality, James will always be remembered for far more than just his success in rugby. Importantly, I believe that's what he would have wanted. Marking Pride Month felt really important, and Carwyn James felt like an important tale as his life coincided with the decriminalisation of homosexuality in Britain. There are plenty of excellent pieces of media and memorials of Carwyn, including the play Carwyn, and both the Welsh and English language versions of Alan Gibbard's biography of Carwyn James, which has been heavily referenced throughout this piece. Hanging out back there. You may notice that some graphics have changed, there's some new photos, things like that. I had a wee refresh for my birthday. I've also updated the shop. You can now find it directly on the website with new designs such as this one. If you would like more regular updates, please check out my Instagram, Facebook, Twitter and or Blue Sky. You can also catch me podding on Rap and Women's Rugby Treehouse somewhat frequently this summer. I don't know, we haven't really figured out what we're going to do during the internationals. A written version of this post can be found on my website, therugbyhistoryproject.com, which is also where you can find the shop and all of my references and footnotes for today's episode. Links down below. If you enjoyed today's episode, please make sure to like and comment and subscribe or follow or whatever the platform you are consuming this is telling you to do. You should do that because it helps.